The moment the cameras went live, the energy in the studio shifted. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind that made every breath feel heavier. Bright lights flooded the stage, illuminating the two figures seated across from each other, both poised and ready. The audience was locked in, a silent yet powerful presence, while millions at home leaned in, waiting to see how this battle of words would unfold. At one end of the table sat Karoline Leavitt, calm and composed, her expression unreadable, exuding the confidence of someone who had come fully prepared. On the other side was David Langford, a well-known liberal reporter with a reputation for pushing narratives rather than uncovering the truth. He adjusted his tie, cleared his throat, and leaned slightly forward, his eyes narrowing, as he prepared to strike first. "Karoline, let's be honest," he began, his voice carrying that polished tone of manufactured sincerity. "The American people deserve the truth, and for too long, they've been misled. Donald Trump built his entire presidency on deception. Just last week, he claimed that under his leadership, the economy was the strongest it had ever been. But let's face reality. Under Biden, unemployment is down, wages are up, and the country is moving forward. Isn't it time we stop pretending that Trump's policies were anything but a failure?" For a moment, there was silence. Not the awkward kind, but the deliberate kind. The kind that thickens tension and forces people to hold their breath. Karoline sat back slightly, her eyes studying David, her lips curving just enough to hint at amusement. It was the look of someone who had been waiting for this exact argument, the look of someone who already knew how this conversation was going to end. She let the weight of his words settle before finally speaking, her voice measured and firm. "David, I appreciate the enthusiasm, but let's not rewrite history just because it fits a convenient narrative." She shifted slightly, her presence commanding, as she turned toward the camera. "You're sitting here, on national television, telling the American people that things are better now? That Biden's leadership has somehow rescued the economy?" The intensity in the room thickened as Karoline prepared to dismantle every carefully rehearsed talking point David had just laid out. He had come in expecting to lead the conversation, but within seconds, it was clear. He wasn't the one in control anymore. David leaned in slightly, sensing an opportunity to press his point. His confidence grew as he continued, his voice carrying the same polished certainty that had served him well in countless interviews before. "Look, Karoline, you can't deny the facts. Under Trump, we saw record-high deficits, a struggling middle class, and policies that only benefited the wealthy. Meanwhile, under Biden, we've seen job growth, wages increasing, and a real effort to rebuild this country from the damage done during Trump's presidency. The numbers don't lie." He paused, giving the audience and viewers at home a moment to absorb his words. There was a rhythm to his approach, a well-practiced method of delivering statements with just enough authority to make them seem unquestionable. But Karoline didn't react the way he expected. She didn't rush to interrupt or flinch under the weight of his accusations. Instead, she remained perfectly still, watching him with an almost amused patience, as if she had heard all of this before and was simply waiting for him to finish. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, controlled. "You're right about one thing, David. The numbers don't lie. But the way you're presenting them? That's another story." She shifted slightly, her gaze never leaving his. "Let's talk about the economy under Trump versus Biden, shall we? Under Trump, the average gas price sat at $2.77 per gallon. Under Biden, Americans are paying well over $4 in many states. Inflation under Trump? Less than 2%. Under Biden, it skyrocketed to over 9% at its peak. And let's not forget unemployment. Before the pandemic, we had the lowest unemployment rate in 50 years, 3.5%. That wasn't luck, David. That was policy. And when the pandemic hit, sure, unemployment spiked because the entire world was in crisis. But under Trump's leadership, we saw the fastest economic recovery in modern history. That's a fact." David shifted slightly in his chair, adjusting his papers, his initial confidence now met with resistance he hadn't anticipated. He opened his mouth to interject, but Karoline wasn't finished. "Now, you want to credit Biden for job growth? Tell me, David, what exactly did Biden do? Because inheriting a recovering economy and taking credit for the rebound isn't leadership, it's opportunism. And that's what the American people see. The air in the studio thickened as the audience absorbed her words. David's carefully crafted argument was unraveling, and Karoline was just getting started. David let out a short chuckle, shaking his head as he leaned forward. Karoline, that's misleading, and you know it. Inflation isn't just an American issue. It's a global crisis. You can't sit here and pretend that Trump had no hand in the economic downturn that Biden had to clean up. And as for gas prices, let's not forget that Trump's reckless policies on energy and trade set the stage for the instability we're seeing today. His voice carried the tone of someone who believed he had just delivered a knockout punch, but Karoline remained unfazed. She tilted her head slightly, her expression unwavering. "David, I'm glad you brought that up," she said smoothly, reaching for a single sheet of paper on the table. "This right here is from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, official data, not opinions. December 2020, right before Biden took office, the inflation rate was at 1.4%. That's not a crisis. That's stability. Now, let's fast forward to January 2022, under Biden's leadership, 7.5%. And at its worst, over 9%. She placed the paper down and folded her hands, letting the numbers speak for themselves. David shifted slightly in his seat. "You're cherry-picking, Karoline. Context matters." She nodded. "Exactly. Context does matter, which is why we should also look at wages. You said earlier that wages are up under Biden. That sounds great, until you compare it to inflation. Wages may have increased, but the cost of living has skyrocketed even faster. So, while Americans are technically earning more, their dollars are worth less. That's not progress. That's economic decline." David exhaled through his nose, trying to mask his frustration. "Come on, Karoline. You're twisting the numbers to fit your argument. The Biden administration has worked to lower costs and provide relief. The American Rescue Plan?" Karoline raised a brow. "The same plan that flooded the economy with so much government spending that it helped fuel inflation? Is that the one you're talking about?" David hesitated for a fraction of a second, just long enough for Karoline to press forward. "And since we're discussing facts, let's talk unemployment, because I noticed you conveniently left something out. Yes, unemployment is low under Biden. But why? Because he inherited an economy that was already bouncing back. Under Trump, before COVID, unemployment hit a 50-year low at 3.5%. When the pandemic hit, it obviously spiked, just like it did in every other country. But what happened next? A rapid recovery. The economy was already on its way up when Biden took office. He didn't fix anything. He just took credit for it." David let out another forced chuckle, shaking his head. "Karoline, you're oversimplifying this. The economy is complex, and you can't just boil it down to a few cherry-picked statistics." Karoline leaned in slightly, her tone calm but unwavering. "David, I didn't cherry-pick anything. I'm giving you direct numbers, straight from official reports. If facts are inconvenient for your argument, that's not my problem." For the first time, the tension in David's shoulders was visible. His confidence wasn't as solid as it had been at the start. He glanced at his notes, as if searching for a way to counter, but there was no easy way out. He had walked into this debate expecting to control the narrative. Instead, he was watching it slip through his fingers. And Karoline wasn't done yet. David adjusted his tie, trying to regain his footing. "Look, Karoline, you're good at spinning things, but let's be honest. Trump's policies created long-term damage. That's just a fact." His voice carried the same forced confidence he had at the start, but there was a shift now, a slight unease beneath the surface. Karoline picked up on it immediately. She exhaled, almost as if she felt sorry for what was about to happen. "David, I understand why you're trying so hard to defend this, but let's not pretend you haven't said the exact opposite before." She reached for a small remote resting on the table. With a single click, the studio screen behind them lit up. "Let's take a look at something, shall we?" The air in the studio thickened as the clip began to play. There was David Langford, sitting in a different studio just months ago, speaking with a different guest. His voice, clear and unmistakable, echoed through the room. If we're being objective, Trump's economic policies did lead to historic job growth and increased wages. You may not like his style, but you can't argue with the numbers. A wave of murmurs rippled through the audience. Some gasped, Others whispered to each other, exchanging looks of disbelief. The contrast was undeniable. On live television, David had just painted Trump's presidency as an economic disaster, yet here he was, caught on record admitting the exact opposite. David blinked rapidly, his mouth opening slightly before he forced out a chuckle. Karoline, you're taking that out of context. That was during a different time? She tilted her head, her expression unreadable. A different time? Her voice was calm, almost amused. David, that statement was from 8 months ago. Are you saying the facts have changed since then, or just your willingness to acknowledge them? David shifted in his seat, trying to maintain his composure. Things evolve, Karoline. The economy is complicated, and one statement doesn't tell the whole story. She nodded, as if she expected that exact response. So, when you praised Trump's policies, that was just a moment in time? But now, when it's politically convenient, you've completely flipped your stance? That's not objectivity, David. That's narrative control. The weight of her words hung in the air. David knew he had been caught, and no carefully worded excuse could change that. He had spent years shaping stories, controlling conversations, steering public opinion. But now, under the glaring lights of the studio, he had lost control of his own. And Karoline wasn't letting go. David swallowed hard, shifting in his seat as if that could somehow make the tension in the room disappear. The once confident journalist, who had come into this debate believing he controlled the conversation, now sat visibly uneasy. The murmurs from the audience hadn't died down. If anything, the weight of their reaction had settled into the air, thick and undeniable. He tried to straighten his posture, but even that couldn't mask the reality. He had just been caught contradicting himself on live television. Karoline let the silence stretch for just a moment longer before reaching down and lifting a folder from the table. She placed it in front of her with deliberate ease, tapping her fingers lightly against the cover. "David, I'd like to give you a fair chance here," she said, her voice smooth but firm. "Maybe this was just an accident. Maybe you misspoke, or maybe you truly believe the numbers change depending on who's in office." She lifted the folder and slowly opened it. "But if that's the case, then I'd love for you to explain this." She pulled out a printed transcript and held it up just enough for the audience to see. "In 2019, you wrote that rising wages and record-low unemployment proved the economy was thriving under Trump. You called it undeniable evidence of a strong recovery. But in 2022, under Biden, you said unemployment numbers don't tell the full story, and that rising wages were misleading because inflation was eating them away. Same data, David. Two completely different takes. What changed? Because the facts didn't." David's jaw tightened. He exhaled sharply through his nose, his fingers curling slightly on the desk. "Karoline, that's an oversimplification. Context matters, and—" "Exactly," she cut in, nodding. "Context does matter, which is why I have more." She flipped through the folder and pulled out another statement. "Here's one from 2020. You wrote that low gas prices were a direct result of Trump's energy policies. But in 2023, when Biden was struggling with soaring prices, you claimed presidents don't control gas prices and that blaming Biden was unfair." She set the paper down in front of him, her gaze unwavering. "So tell me, David, do presidents control gas prices, or does that only apply when a Republican is in office?" The silence that followed was deafening. David's usual smooth delivery was gone. He had no quick comeback, no well-rehearsed talking point to escape the corner he had been backed into. His fingers tapped against the table, his lips pressing together in a thin line. He opened his mouth as if to respond, but nothing came out. Karoline leaned forward slightly, her voice steady. "This is the problem, David. It's not that you got it wrong once. It's that you shift your stance depending on who's in power. You don't report the news, you shape it. You tell people what to think, and when the facts don't fit the narrative you want, you twist them. That's not journalism. That's manipulation." David looked down for a brief second, as if searching his notes for a lifeline. But there was none. His credibility had crumbled in real time, and the entire world was watching. The moderator cleared his throat, shifting in his seat as he glanced between them, clearly desperate to regain control of the situation. "Well, that was certainly a lively discussion," he said with a forced chuckle, hoping to ease the tension. But no one laughed. The damage was done. The studio was thick with the weight of what had just happened, and no amount of polished television hosting could smooth it over. David Langford, once the confident interrogator, now sat stiffly, his usual air of authority shattered. His hands remained on the table, his fingers lightly gripping the edges as if holding on to something solid would keep him from sinking further. Outside the studio, the fallout had already begun. Within minutes, social media exploded. Hashtag David Langford exposed shot to the top of trending lists, and clips of the debate flooded every platform. Edits replayed the exact moment David realized he had lost, some slowing it down frame by frame, others adding captions like, "Watch this man's soul leave his body." Memes popped up instantly, and reaction videos dissected every part of his unraveling. Even those who typically supported him struggled to defend what had just unfolded. Mainstream media, usually quick to circle the wagons, hesitated. Some networks tried to ignore it, hoping it would blow over, but the full interview was everywhere. His own network remained silent, offering no damage control, no carefully worded response, nothing. And that silence spoke louder than words. Meanwhile, Karoline's phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Invitations for interviews poured in, from news programs to independent podcasts. People weren't just listening. They were questioning. They were seeing, maybe for the first time, how easily narratives could be twisted. And that was the real victory. As the cameras remained on, Karoline took a slow breath, her expression steady but firm. She had said everything she needed to say to David, and the silence on his end had spoken louder than any defense he could have offered. But now, she turned her attention to the real audience. The millions watching from home, the people who had just witnessed, in real time, how easily the truth could be twisted and reshaped to fit an agenda. "This is exactly why independent thinking matters," she said, her voice calm but unwavering. "This is why questioning narratives matters. Because when the media picks and chooses which truths to tell, it's not just bias, it's manipulation. And the people deserve better." She let the words settle, knowing they carried weight. They tell you what to believe. They rewrite history right in front of you and expect you not to notice. But you should notice. You should ask questions. You should demand the truth, even when it's inconvenient for those in power. She leaned in slightly, her final words clear and direct. Stay informed. Stay skeptical. Stay engaged. Because the only way to fight deception is to see it for what it is. Then, just like that, the screen faded to black.